Before the first date was marked, before names were fixed into records, before history learned how to speak in ink, human life was already deep, complex, and continuous. There was no opening chapter announced by a single moment. There was only movement. Footsteps pressed into soil, erased by wind, pressed again somewhere else. Firelight flickered against skin, not to illuminate progress, but to hold back night for a few more hours. In that long stretch of time, memory did not sit still. It travelled with bodies, returned with seasons, and lingered in places where people paused long enough to feel familiar. Silence did not mean emptiness. It meant that nothing had yet demanded to be written down. Stories lived inside gestures, in repeated paths across land, in the way hands learned the same motions without being shown why. Knowledge survived because it was useful, because it worked, because it fit the world it moved through. When conditions changed, memory changed with them. Nothing needed permission to adapt. No authority decided which version of the past would remain. Meaning was carried forward quietly, reinforced by repetition rather than record. From a modern distance, this absence can feel unsettling. We are trained to trust what leaves a trace, to believe that what is documented is what mattered most. Yet the longest span of human existence unfolded without leaving behind words to guide us. There were no timelines to anchor events, no archives to gather experiences into neat order. What existed instead was a rhythm, steady and responsive, shaped by weather, terrain, and the fragile balance between risk and survival. It is tempting to call this time primitive, to imagine it as a waiting room before real history began. But that assumption comes from a world that confuses visibility with importance. What survives in stone and script feels solid because it endures, not because it was more meaningful. Silence only appears empty when we expect answers to arrive fully formed. In truth, much of human knowledge was never meant to outlast the moment it served. Its success was measured by continuity, not preservation. When we listen closely, this silence begins to feel heavy rather than hollow. It carries the weight of countless lives lived without awareness of how they would be remembered. People did not act with the goal of becoming history. They acted to eat, to shelter, to remain part of a world that could turn hostile without warning. Their decisions shaped the future without intending to. The absence of their names does not erase their influence. It simply hides it from easy recognition. What we call prehistory is not a blank space behind us. It is a vast foundation beneath everything that followed. It holds the slow development of cooperation, the refinement of attention, the early understanding of cycles and limits. None of this required writing to exist. It required only presence and repetition, learned over time and passed on through living example. Silence preserved these things precisely because they were never fixed in place. As this quiet stretches backward, it begins to challenge the way time itself is felt. Without dates, events blur into motion. Without names, importance dissolves into pattern. Yet something remains unmistakably human within that blur. Intention without record, intelligence without archive. The past does not vanish here. It softens. It waits. And as attention settles into that waiting, the boundary between what is known and what is assumed begins to loosen, preparing the way to question how modern timelines may have narrowed what once unfolded freely. This is where unease quietly enters, not as fear, but as awareness. If memory once moved through landscapes and bodies rather than pages, then much of what shaped us may never announce itself clearly. It may appear only as instinct, as repetition, as a feeling that something older is present beneath familiar explanations. Silence, in this sense, is not the end of the story. It is the space that allows the story to continue without demanding attention. And it is within that space that the outlines of forgotten time begin to emerge, faint but persistent, inviting us to look again at where history truly starts. It reaches further than assumed. History often presents civilization as a sudden arrival. One moment, humanity wanders. The next, fields are planted, cities rise, and writing appears as if summoned by necessity. This clean beginning feels reassuring. It offers a clear line to stand behind, a moment that explains everything that follows. Agriculture becomes the switch, writing the confirmation, and everything before quietly dissolves into preparation. But this shape is comforting precisely because it is simple, not because it is complete. When timelines are compressed, thousands of years collapse into a single step forward. The long process of trial, hesitation, and reversal is smoothed into inevitability. It becomes easy to believe that civilization was waiting to happen, held back only by the absence of a few discoveries. Yet nothing in human behavior suggests such impatience. Skills emerge slowly. Cooperation is refined across generations. Shared symbols develop through repetition, not revelation. These processes leave traces long before anyone thinks to record them. The idea of a first civilization depends on drawing a line where continuity actually exists. Farming does not appear from nowhere. It grows from intimate knowledge of plants, seasons, and soil gained through observation over countless cycles. Permanent settlement relies on social trust, already tested through shared risk. Even writing does not invent memory. It captures a version of memory already practiced. These foundations are rarely acknowledged because they do not fit neatly into a starting date. Calling earlier societies primitive creates distance. It implies absence rather than difference. But complexity does not begin when structures harden. It begins when people coordinate, anticipate, and imagine beyond immediate survival. These abilities did not suddenly emerge at the edge of history. They were carried forward invisibly, refined long before they left durable marks. What survives archaeologically is what stopped moving. What came before often moved too well to remain. Official timelines favor moments that can be pointed to. They prefer walls, tablets, and ruins. Mobility, adaptation, and impermanence resist such framing. As a result, history appears to begin when change slows enough to leave debris behind. This does not mean earlier cultures lacked organization. It means their organization was flexible, responsive, and difficult to freeze in time. What feels like a beginning may simply be the moment life became easier to measure. The appeal of a clear origin is emotional. Beginnings promise understanding. They allow the past to feel manageable and contained. Without them, history stretches uncomfortably far, dissolving certainty. Yet, that discomfort is also an invitation. It asks whether the story we inherited is a simplification designed for clarity rather than accuracy. It suggests that civilization was not born in a moment, but condensed into one for convenience. As this realization settles, the boundary between prehistory and history begins to blur. Instead of a leap, there is a gradient. Instead of invention, there is accumulation. The question quietly shifts. If civilization did not suddenly begin, then the real mystery is not when it started, but how human minds were already prepared for it, long before writing taught memory how to stay still. Once that stillness is questioned, certainty loosens. The idea of a single birthplace for civilization begins to feel less like discovery and more like storytelling. What if origins were never meant to be clean? What if human development unfolded like erosion rather than construction, shaped by pressure, repetition, and time? This perspective does not erase agriculture or writing. It places them within a longer arc, where thinking, cooperation, and meaning were already alive. Seen this way, the first civilizations are no longer starting points. They are pauses, moments when movement slowed just enough for traces to remain, and beyond those pauses, something quieter continues, waiting to be noticed. That quiet continuation carries the story forward, gently leading attention toward the minds that existed before symbols fixed thought into shape, where memory remained flexible, shared, and inseparable from living experience alone across generations now. Before writing fixed thought into symbols, human minds learned to remember in motion. Memory was not stored, it was practiced. It lived in repeated actions, in shared routines, in paths walked often enough to feel known. Knowledge stayed alive by being used, not by being recorded. A gesture taught a technique, a rhythm marked time. A place itself became instruction, reminding those who returned what had worked before. In this world, remembering was collective. No single person carried the whole story. Each individual held a fragment shaped by role, age, and experience, and those fragments aligned through repetition. Stories were not recited word for word, they were re-entered. Rituals did not preserve the past as fact, but as feeling. Through movement, sound, and repetition, memory remained flexible, adjusting as environments shifted. Without written reference, attention mattered differently. Observation sharpened because forgetting carried risk. Subtle changes in weather, animal behavior, or landscape were noticed and remembered because survival depended on it. Thought followed cycles rather than lines, returning to patterns instead of progressing forward. Time was sensed through recurrence, not counted through numbers. In this context, intelligence expressed itself as sensitivity, not abstraction. From a modern perspective, this way of knowing can appear fragile. We are accustomed to storing memory outside ourselves, trusting written symbols to hold truth steady. Yet writing did not simply expand memory, it reshaped it. When knowledge could be preserved without rehearsal, certain skills became less necessary. Pattern recognition narrowed. Situational awareness softened. Some capacities faded quietly, replaced by permanence. This does not mean earlier minds were inferior. They were adapted to different demands. Intelligence was distributed across community and landscape, rather than isolated in records. Meaning emerged through participation rather than explanation. What mattered was not accuracy across centuries, but usefulness within living memory. Knowledge survived by changing shape, staying relevant rather than staying fixed. To remember without writing was to remain in constant relationship with the world. Memory lived in the body, in muscles that knew how to move, in voices that adjusted stories without noticing. It lived in place, where returning to the same ground restored understanding without instruction. Losing writing would feel like loss to us. Losing this embodied memory was a quieter trade few recognized. Over time, as symbols replaced movement, memory became something to consult rather than inhabit. This shift felt like progress, and in many ways it was. But something else receded with it, something harder to name. The past no longer lived in every action. It began to sit apart, preserved, observed, no longer fully experienced. Understanding these minds does not require romanticizing them. It requires recognizing that cognition adapts to environment. When conditions change, intelligence changes form. Writing created continuity across time, but it also narrowed perception to what could be written. As that realization settles, attention shifts naturally away from thought itself and toward what remains behind when thinking leaves no words. Those remnants are rarely sentences or names. They take physical form, scattered and silent. Tools shaped by repeated hands, markings pressed into stone, pathways worn smoother than chance would allow. These traces become the only witnesses left to speak for lives that never intended to be remembered. As attention moves toward these material echoes, the mind prepares to read memory, not through language, but through pattern, weight, and absence itself. It is here that the story continues, no longer inside minds alone, but etched faintly into the world. When writing has not yet claimed authority, objects and landscapes carry memory forward without explanation. They do not tell us what to think, only that something once happened here. Following these quiet markers requires patience rather than certainty, inviting a different way of listening as the journey moves outward into earth, stone, and time. These silent records now wait beneath history, ready to be noticed as attention shifts from minds to the ground itself at last now. Before walls rose or symbols were pressed into clay, the land was already keeping a record. It did not do so intentionally. It did not decide what mattered. Memory gathered slowly, through repetition, through return. Feet crossed the same ground until soil tightened beneath them. Camps formed where shelter, water, and warmth aligned, and each visit deepened the trace left behind. Over time, movement itself shaped terrain into quiet testimony. Paths appeared without planning. They curved not because of design, but because bodies favored ease, safety, and familiarity. Vegetation thinned where people passed often, while nearby areas grew dense and untouched. Fire altered soil chemistry in places returned to again and again. None of this announced significance. Yet together, these changes accumulated into patterns that outlasted those who caused them. Seen from a distance, landscape can appear neutral, indifferent to human presence. But neutrality is often the result of forgetting how to look. The land responds to attention. It registers weight, heat, disturbance, and pause. Even brief stays leave subtle impressions, layered across seasons and generations. When repeated long enough, these impressions become durable, not as monuments, but as tendencies. This kind of memory does not preserve events. It preserves behavior. It records where people felt safe enough to return, where movement slowed, where gatherings took place. Unlike written accounts, these records do not exaggerate importance. They simply reflect repetition. What happened often enough becomes visible. What happened once dissolves back into possibility. Modern perspectives favor dramatic remnants. Ruins, tools, and structures feel like confirmation because they resemble our own methods of remembering. Yet most of the past did not crystallize into durable form. It remained flexible, adaptive, light. As a result, the most persistent records are not objects, but altered ground, patterned vegetation, and unnatural alignments that only reveal themselves over long observation. Reading these signs requires restraint. Expectation can obscure what repetition reveals. When archaeology searches only for what resembles civilization, it misses what civilization grew from. Listening to land means allowing patterns to appear without forcing meaning onto them. It means noticing absence as carefully as presence, and recognizing that silence can be informative without speaking. In this way, Earth becomes archive, not a catalogue of moments, but a map of behavior stretched across time. Each compressed layer of soil reflects choices made without thought of permanence. Each altered slope or clearing carries memory forward without interpretation. The land does not explain itself, it waits. As this perspective settles, attention begins to shift. If landscapes remember through movement, then objects left within them must carry memory differently. What remains behind, shaped by human hands and abandoned by necessity or choice, becomes the next layer of quiet testimony. With the land now recognized as witness, the story turns toward the things it holds, still and patient, ready to be noticed. This patience changes how time feels. Instead of rushing toward conclusions, attention slows, noticing how long it takes for small actions to matter. A single footprint vanishes quickly, but thousands alter drainage, growth, and direction. Memory here is cumulative, not deliberate. It builds quietly, asking nothing of those who create it. The earth does not distinguish between intention and accident. It accepts both equally and holds them until someone learns to see their shape. When viewed this way, the past stops feeling distant. It becomes layered beneath every step, present without announcement. Hills, clearings, and riverbanks are no longer scenery, but conversation partners that respond over centuries rather than moments. The challenge is not that the land refuses to speak, but that it speaks too slowly for impatient questions. To understand it requires surrendering certainty and allowing time to stretch again. With this awareness, the landscape no longer feels empty between discoveries. It feels full, crowded with motion that once passed through and moved on. And as the ground gives way to the first objects intentionally shaped and then released, attention prepares to narrow, shifting from wide patterns to the quiet focus of what human hands once carried, used, and left behind without knowing they would one day be searched for. Soon, objects emerge as memory, silent but heavier than soil, demanding closer attention from careful human observers. Before stories were shaped into words, hands were already shaping stone, bone, and wood. Tools appeared quietly, without announcement, formed not by sudden insight but by repetition. A motion discovered once was tried again. If it worked, it was remembered through use. If it failed, it disappeared without record. Over time, certain forms endured, not because they were perfected, but because they fit the needs of bodies moving through a particular world. Every tool carries intention stretched across generations. Even the simplest edge suggests testing, adjustment, and transmission. Someone learned where to strike, how much force to apply, which angle held best. Someone else watched, copied, refined. No explanation was required. Knowledge passed through demonstration rather than description. In this way, tools became memory solidified into shape. It is easy to mistake early tools for crude beginnings. Their simplicity can feel like lack. Yet simplicity often signals refinement. What remains unnecessary is removed through repetition. What remains effective is preserved. Tools evolve by shedding excess, becoming quieter with time. Each surviving form reflects countless decisions that left no other trace. These objects imply communities of learning. A tool made once is an accident. A tool made repeatedly is tradition. For tradition to exist, memory must be shared and trusted. Someone had to believe that repeating the same motion mattered. Someone had to teach without naming the lesson. Tools reveal this trust indirectly, through consistency rather than speech. Unlike stories, tools do not explain themselves. They offer no context, no myth, no justification. They simply exist, waiting to be held, measured, compared. Yet, in their silence, they speak of planning. A cutting edge anticipates resistance. A handle suggests prolonged use. A shaped point implies foresight, an awareness of future need. These are not random acts. They are signs of minds projecting forward without recording why. Over time, tools became companions to daily life. They shaped tasks and were shaped by them. Hands adapted to objects, just as objects adapted to hands. This mutual refinement created continuity stronger than language. Even as beliefs shifted and camps moved, certain forms persisted because they worked. In this persistence, tools outlasted stories that might have explained them. Many cultures vanished without leaving names, but their tools remained. Stone survives where memory fades. Wood decays, but impressions linger. These objects become the only witnesses to entire ways of living. They do not tell us who their makers were, but they reveal how they thought. They show patience, adaptation, and respect for effort repeated until it became reliable. Innovation here is not sudden change. It is continuity refined. The intelligence behind these tools lies not in novelty, but in stability maintained over long time. Progress unfolds quietly, almost invisibly, through small adjustments carried forward without announcement. This challenges the assumption that complexity requires scale. Intelligence can exist wherever repetition is honored. As attention rests on these silent forms, it becomes clear that tools are not isolated achievements. They belong to larger patterns of cooperation, movement, and shared purpose. Objects alone do not explain themselves. They hint at coordination beyond the individual. And it is within these larger patterns, woven from many quiet actions, that the story begins to widen again, drawing focus away from single artifacts and toward the collective shaping of entire worlds together over time. In recognizing tools as memory made durable, the past becomes heavier, not with answers, but with presence. These objects do not resolve questions, they deepen them. They suggest lives organized around rhythms now difficult to imagine, yet structured enough to leave form behind. And as this understanding settles, attention shifts once more, preparing to trace the broader patterns that emerged when many hands, tools, and intentions aligned, shaping landscapes and communities through shared motion, rather than written plan alone. Long before plans were drawn or rules announced, order was already forming. It did not arrive as a decision. It emerged through repetition. People returned to the same places because those places worked. They moved at certain times because conditions demanded it. Over time, these choices aligned, not through agreement, but through shared necessity. What formed was not chaos, but a quiet structure built from habits rather than intention. Settlements grew without being designed. Camps expanded where water stayed reliable. Paths connected locations that mattered repeatedly. Movement followed cycles shaped by seasons, animals, and growth. No single mind coordinated these patterns, yet coordination appeared. Each person adjusted to what others had already done, reinforcing behavior without naming it. Stability developed not because it was planned, but because it was useful. From a distance, this kind of order can appear accidental. Without walls or maps, it seems temporary. Yet repetition creates resilience. What is repeated becomes expected. What is expected becomes reliable. These expectations shape behavior more strongly than instruction. Over time, invisible systems take hold, guiding choices without demanding obedience. They feel natural because they emerge from lived experience rather than imposed rule. Modern thinking often equates structure with design. We imagine order as something created deliberately, supported by authority and enforced by agreement. But early systems did not wait for permission to exist. They formed wherever people interacted long enough for patterns to settle. Cooperation arose not from ideology, but from rhythm. Shared timing mattered more than shared belief. This kind of structure adapts easily. When conditions change, habits shift, patterns dissolve and reform without collapsing. There is no blueprint to defend, no fixed plan to protect. Flexibility becomes strength. What appears disorganized from the outside often holds a subtle coherence responsive to pressure and change. The quiet twist lies here. Complexity does not require foresight. It can arise from persistence. Systems grow when small actions accumulate across time. Order does not always announce itself. Sometimes it emerges so slowly that no one notices it forming. By the time it feels solid, it has already shaped behavior for generations. These early societies were not unfinished versions of what came later. They were complete responses to their environments. Their systems were just light enough to move with changing conditions. Planning existed, but it was embedded in action rather than recorded in advance. Knowledge was carried forward through doing, not instruction. Over time, repeated patterns began to resist change. As populations grew and movement slowed, what once adapted easily started to harden. Habits became expectations. Expectations became roles. Roles began to define place and purpose. The same systems that once allowed flexibility gradually produced constraint. This shift did not feel sudden. It felt normal. Structure did not replace freedom overnight. It accumulated until alternatives became harder to imagine. When patterns endure long enough, they begin to feel inevitable. That inevitability marks the threshold between fluid systems and fixed ones. As invisible structures grew heavier, the world they shaped became easier to measure and control. Patterns once responsive began to persist beyond necessity. In that persistence, something new emerged, something recognizable. Without a single decision, without a master plan, early order slowly transformed into permanence. With this transformation, the story moves forward. What once formed quietly through habit began to crystallize into something harder to reverse. The systems that emerged without blueprints prepared the ground for structures that would soon demand them. Civilization does not appear from intention alone. It condenses from repetition. And as repetition continues, what was once flexible begins to solidify, preparing the way for permanence to take hold at last. That slow solidification is not a failure of imagination, but a consequence of time compressing choice. When repetition outpaces reflection, patterns gain weight and begin to guide behavior without negotiation. What once responded to conditions starts responding to memory instead. In that moment, flexibility quietly narrows. The ground becomes claimed, roles become inherited, and movement slows. Without realizing it, societies cross a line where change requires effort, not instinct, and the era of fluid adaptation gives way to something recognizably permanent. And this shift reshapes every future system that follows, slowly, inevitably onward. History often frames civilization as a turning point, a clean break where wandering ended and permanence began. One moment people moved with seasons, the next they stayed. One moment life was uncertain, the next it was organized. But this sense of sudden change is a story told backward. From within the moment itself, nothing felt resolved. There was no signal announcing arrival. There was only experimentation, hesitation, and long periods of return to what already worked. Change unfolded unevenly. Groups lingered longer in familiar places, then moved on again. Seasonal camps became more comfortable, then were abandoned, then revisited. Simple structures appeared, decayed, and were rebuilt differently. New behaviors did not replace old ones. They sat beside them, overlapping and competing. Movement continued, even as staying became possible. Nothing insisted on commitment. Everything remained provisional. From the outside, this can look like progress inching forward. From the inside, it felt more like testing ground that never quite held. People weighed risk without naming it. Staying meant proximity to resources, but also vulnerability. Moving meant freedom, but also uncertainty. Each choice carried consequences that could not yet be measured. Reversibility mattered. What could not be undone was approached carefully, if at all. Farming did not arrive fully formed. It appeared in fragments, tried and set aside, then tried again under different conditions. Some groups planted and returned later. Others experimented briefly and moved on. Knowledge did not spread evenly. It moved through networks of contact, shaped by environment more than intention. What worked in one place failed in another. Nothing guaranteed success. This slow drift challenges the idea that development was obvious or desirable. Stability brings predictability, but it also narrows options. Early communities sensed this intuitively. The future that permanence promised was unknown. There was no assurance that staying would outweigh the loss of flexibility. From that uncertainty came caution, not ambition. Hesitation was not resistance to change. It was awareness of cost. The word progress implies direction. But for much of this transition, direction was unclear. Change did not point forward. It circled, returned, paused. Advances were fragile and easily undone. A dry season, a shift in climate, or conflict could erase years of experimentation. Nothing felt inevitable. Civilization did not pull humanity forward. Humanity edged toward it without certainty. This reframing alters how origins are felt. Instead of an upgrade, early settlement becomes a compromise. It traded mobility for control, adaptability for storage. The cost of that trade was not yet visible. There was no memory of collapse to warn against accumulation. People did not move toward cities because they believed them superior. They moved because local conditions allowed it, just long enough for habits to settle. Over time, repetition changed caution into familiarity. What began as trial slowly became expectation. Choices once weighed became default. This is how change finally stuck. Not because it was planned, but because it became easier to continue than to reverse. As uncertainty softened into routine, certain paths gained momentum. Understanding this shift requires letting go of dramatic moments. Civilization did not begin with certainty. It emerged from indecision repeated long enough to feel stable. What followed was not triumph, but adjustment. And as these adjustments accumulated, questions changed. The story no longer asks when change happened, but why some changes endured while others faded. That question waits just ahead, shaped by forces quieter than invention and stronger than intention, beginning to press gently on attention as the drift continues. Before permanence existed, staying was temporary by default. People paused, then moved. Even when conditions were good, departure remained expected. Familiarity did not yet imply obligation. But slowly, almost without noticing, some stays stretched longer than planned. What began as convenience softened into routine. Routine settled into preference. And preference began to shape how the future was imagined. Permanence was not first a structure. It was a feeling. It arrived quietly when people realized they would return to the same place again and again. Storage appeared not as innovation, but as response. When leaving grew uncertain, keeping made sense. Surplus became protection. Protection became reassurance. Movement, once instinctive, started to feel disruptive rather than necessary. As staying lengthened, paths narrowed. Fewer routes were taken. Familiar ground gained importance through repetition. Land was not claimed by declaration, it was claimed by return. The more often a place was revisited, the more it began to feel central. Memory gathered around fixed locations rather than moving cycles. Time began to feel layered instead of flowing. This shift altered relationships subtly. When people expect to remain nearby, dependency increases. Cooperation deepens, but so does tension. Resources are shared more carefully. Disagreements linger longer. Stability allows planning, but it also creates vulnerability. When movement is easy, loss can be avoided. When movement slows, loss must be managed. Permanence reshaped how the future felt. Instead of adapting moment by moment, people began to anticipate outcomes. Effort invested now was expected to return later. The idea of accumulation took hold, not as desire, but as logic. What could be stored could be relied upon. What could be relied upon shaped behavior. The future grew heavier, anchored to what had already been gathered. Memory changed alongside this shift. Instead of being refreshed through repetition, it began to be preserved. Knowledge was no longer only something practiced, it became something kept. Skills still mattered, but storage reduced urgency. When resources could be saved, adaptation slowed. What worked before was repeated longer, even when conditions shifted. This did not feel dangerous. It felt safe. Comfort rarely announces its cost. The ground felt predictable. Seasons seemed manageable. Life appeared less uncertain. Yet, dependency quietly replaced flexibility. When systems rely on accumulation, loss becomes catastrophic rather than temporary. Stability creates stakes. As permanence settled, imagination narrowed. The range of possible futures condensed. Movement became exception instead of expectation. Staying was no longer a choice revisited daily. It became the baseline. This psychological shift mattered more than any tool or structure. It altered how people related to time itself. The present began to serve the future rather than respond to it. Nothing about this transition required agreement. It spread through habit. Those born into permanence never experienced its absence. What once felt like experiment became normal. In that normalization, change slowed further. Reversal grew costly. The longer permanence lasted, the harder it became to imagine alternatives. With permanence established, new pressures emerged. Staying required management. Storage needed protection. Prediction demanded coordination. These demands did not arise from ambition, but from necessity. Once remaining in place could not easily be undone, systems began forming to support it. The future had taken on weight. Memory had begun to accumulate rather than circulate. And as this weight increased, responses followed. Structures appeared not to innovate life, but to stabilize it. From this quiet psychological shift, something new began to rise, not as invention, but as maintenance, guiding the story toward the systems that grew to hold permanence together. That maintenance would slowly extend beyond individuals. Families adjusted first, then groups, then expectations hardened between them. What began as shared effort edged toward organization. The longer people stayed, the more they depended on continuity. Tools, spaces, and relationships took on fixed roles. With each generation raised inside these conditions, permanence stopped feeling chosen. It felt inherited. An inheritance carries obligation. Once obligation appears, freedom must negotiate rather than move. This is where permanence stops being a shelter and begins becoming a structure. The shift is quiet, almost invisible, but it changes everything that follows. From this point forward, remaining in place would define survival, identity, and memory, setting the stage for systems that could no longer informal. No one gathered to invent rules. No council met to design hierarchy. Systems appeared quietly, shaped by friction rather than vision. When people stayed close for long periods, conflicts emerged naturally. Space had to be shared. Resources had to be timed. Access required negotiation. Each small solution solved a problem in the moment, but repetition gave those solutions weight. What worked once was tried again. What was tried again became expected. Expectation is where structure begins. When behavior repeats, deviation starts to feel noticeable. People learn what usually happens and adjust themselves accordingly. Over time, patterns stop responding to individual choice and begin guiding it. No authority needs to announce control when habit already performs that function. Structure arrives disguised as normalcy. Roles formed the same way. Someone handled storage because they were nearby. Someone mediated disputes because they were trusted. These roles were not assigned, they accumulated. What began as convenience slowly hardened into responsibility. When the same person performs the same function long enough, the role begins to feel permanent. Others adjust around it. Dependence forms without demand. This is how systems often precede power. Authority follows structure, not the reverse. Once expectations are fixed, enforcement becomes unnecessary. People comply because deviation disrupts rhythm. Control feels invisible because it grows from shared coordination rather than imposed rule. The quiet twist lies here. No one has to want control for it to emerge. It arises naturally wherever cooperation persists long enough. As systems grew, they began shaping behavior more than responding to it. Actions were chosen not only for survival, but for conformity to expectation. This shift did not feel restrictive at first. It felt stabilizing. Predictability reduced conflict. Repetition eased decision-making. Yet each reduction in choice narrowed adaptability slightly. Over time, complexity increased. More people meant more interactions. More interactions required more patterns. Patterns layered over one another, creating systems no single person fully understood. What began as simple coordination grew beyond individual awareness. Systems acquired momentum. They survived even when circumstances changed. This is where early societies crossed a subtle threshold. Structures, once flexible, became resistant. Adjusting them required effort rather than instinct. Change became disruptive. Stability demanded maintenance. No one designed this outcome. It emerged through accumulation. The unsettling realization is not that control exists, but that it does not require intention. Systems do not need to be planned to become powerful. They need only repetition, proximity, and time. Once established, they begin shaping thought itself. People born into them cannot remember alternatives. As these unintended systems solidified, something distinctly new appeared. Life began organizing itself around permanence rather than adaptation. Prehistory did not end in collapse or invention. It quietly transformed. And from these unseen systems, civilization would soon take shape, recognizable not by moment, but by momentum. Civilization is often treated as a starting line, a point where history finally becomes visible, measurable, and real. Stone walls rise, writing appears, cities anchor themselves to land, and from that moment forward, the past feels clear. Everything before becomes preparation, everything after becomes progress. But this clarity is misleading. It is not the beginning of the story. It is a snapshot taken mid-motion. What survives in the ground favors what resists decay. Stone lasts, fired clay endures. Heavy structures announce themselves long after the people who built them disappear. Softer forms of life leave less behind. Wood returns to soil. Movement leaves faint traces. Adaptation dissolves instead of accumulating. The historical record does not capture everything evenly. It captures what slows down long enough to harden. Seen this way, early civilizations are not origins. They are moments when flexibility gave way to permanence. They appear suddenly in history, not because they emerged suddenly, but because they stop changing shape. When life becomes rigid, it leaves marks. When it remains fluid, it passes quietly through time. This creates an illusion of beginning. Archaeological clarity increases as adaptability decreases. The clearer the evidence, the narrower the range of behavior that produced it. What we call the first civilizations may simply be the first that stayed in one configuration long enough to fossilize themselves into history. Everything that came before moved too freely to be captured in the same way. This realization shifts perception. History does not start where life began to matter. It starts where life became heavy. When movement slowed, debris accumulated. When repetition hardened into permanence, traces became unavoidable. The absence of earlier evidence is not proof of absence. It is proof of mobility, of systems that did not aim to remain visible. The calm danger of visibility is that it feels authoritative. Ruins persuade easily. They look intentional, impressive, advanced. Yet they represent only a narrow slice of human possibility. They show us what endurance looks like, not what adaptability achieved. Cultures that avoided permanence may have lasted longer than those that built monuments, but longevity does not translate into stone. This does not diminish civilization. It contextualizes it. Writing, cities, and hierarchy did not emerge from nothing. They condensed from systems already alive. What we see is not the first step, but a paused step, a moment when motion slowed just enough for history to catch up. The hypnotic quality of ruins lies in their stillness. They suggest finality, completion. But stillness can be misleading. It hides the motion that preceded it. Civilizations feel foundational because they remain. But remaining is not the same as originating. When this perspective settles, the idea of first loses weight. Civilization becomes a phase, not a birth. A form that arose when flexibility reached its limit under growing pressure. Evidence becomes clearer, not because intelligence increased, but because adaptability narrowed. And with that narrowing came loss. Flexibility traded itself for scale. Movement gave way to accumulation. Systems that once responded fluidly now held firm, even when conditions shifted. This trade produced visibility, but it also erased alternatives. As the snapshot sharpens, attention turns naturally toward what fell outside the frame. If civilization is a freeze frame rather than a beginning, then something disappeared when the picture held still. Understanding that loss does not require mourning, it requires noticing. What vanished was not ignorance, but variation. Not simplicity, but responsiveness. The next step in this story is not to celebrate civilization's arrival, but to examine what faded as it took hold. As flexibility surrendered to permanence, certain capacities slipped quietly away. And it is within that disappearance that the deeper cost of staying becomes visible, preparing the ground for what follows, where stability begins, revealing its price. Structure did not arrive as a conquest. It arrived as reassurance. It promised reliability where uncertainty had ruled. Systems stabilized access to food, coordinated labor, and extended survival beyond immediate conditions. These gains were real. They mattered. But every form of stability carries a quiet cost, not announced as loss, but felt as distance. As permanence settled, adaptability softened. Seasonal knowledge that once guided movement lost urgency when storage bridged scarcity. The ability to respond quickly to change mattered less when reserves existed. Over time, sensitivity to subtle shifts faded, not because it failed, but because it was no longer required every day. What is not used grows quiet. Relational memory with land changed as well. When people moved often, knowledge stayed local and responsive. Staying anchored transformed place into property rather than partner. The land no longer taught through return. It became something to manage. Familiarity deepened, but attentiveness narrowed. Cycles were still observed, but less intimately felt. None of this marks decline. It marks trade. Structure allowed scale. It supported larger populations and more complex coordination. It made continuity possible across generations. But it also reduced immediacy. Experience stretched outward, projected into futures that demanded maintenance rather than response. Inequality emerged not as betrayal, but as byproduct. Stored surplus required oversight. Oversight created roles. Roles accumulated influence. What began as organization became stratification. Rigidity followed, not because of error, but because systems designed to hold stability resisted change. Ecological strain followed similar logic. Stability encouraged extraction beyond renewal. When movement slowed, pressure focused. Systems optimized for reliability struggled with variation. Success demanded repetition. Repetition intensified strain. These outcomes were not failures of understanding. They were consequences of efficiency. The discomfort lies here. Civilization's earliest problems arose from what worked. Structure protected survival, but reduced elasticity. Growth expanded reach, but narrowed perspective. Nothing was taken away deliberately. Capacities simply became less necessary, then less remembered. This loss does not demand mourning. It asks recognition. Sensitivity gave way to predictability. Adaptation yielded to accumulation. These shifts reshaped human experience quietly, without announcement. What disappeared did so gently, overshadowed by what remained visible. With this recognition, attention drifts toward what escaped structure entirely. Cultures that chose lightness over endurance, movement over permanence, left little to measure. Their silence now waits beyond the reach of ruins. Some societies do not disappear because they fail. They disappear because they leave on purpose. This possibility sits quietly beneath the historical record, unsettling not because it is provable, but because it fits what absence often looks like. Where permanence is avoided, little remains. Where endurance is not the goal, memory does not gather into monuments. Instead, continuity flows through movement, adaptation, and release. It is tempting to assume that what lasts mattered most. Stone persuades us of importance. Ruins feel like success simply because they remain. But endurance can be mistaken for achievement. A civilization built to stay must invest in weight. One built to adapt invests in timing. Both require intelligence. Only one leaves evidence that survives. Patterns across deep time suggest that some cultures may have organized themselves to avoid accumulation entirely. Not out of ignorance, but awareness. Storage invites conflict. Permanence attracts dependency. Growth creates pressure that demands defense. Choosing lightness reduces these risks. Mobility becomes protection. Disappearance becomes strategy. These societies would not announce their intent. Avoiding permanence requires no declaration. It requires only the refusal to settle long enough to harden. Knowledge remains embodied rather than archived. Roles remain flexible rather than inherited. When conditions change, departure is not failure, but fluency. To modernize, this looks like loss. A settlement appears, then vanishes. A tool tradition ends abruptly. A region goes quiet. We assume collapse because collapse leaves patterns we recognize. But deliberate dissolution leaves none. It resolves its own traces. What remains is silence mistaken for erasure. This possibility reshapes how the past is read. Absence becomes signal rather than gap. Silence carries intention. Disappearance reflects choice. A culture optimized for continuity rather than memory would survive by not staying recognizable. It would pass forward skills, relationships, and rhythms without binding them to place or structure. Such civilizations would be invisible to history because history rewards stillness. The record fills where motion slows. Cultures that cycle intentionally through appearance and withdrawal would evade capture. Their success would be measured in longevity, not debris. The twist rests here. Failure leaves ruins, success may leave none. What if adaptation outperformed permanence so thoroughly that it erased itself from view? What if the most resilient societies learned when to dissolve before rigidity could trap them? This is not a romantic claim. It is a functional one. Systems designed to persist must defend themselves against change. Systems designed to adapt align with change instead. When flexibility remains central, collapse becomes unnecessary. Ending is chosen before pressure demands it. This reframing softens the fear of loss. Not everything that disappears breaks. Some things complete themselves. In this light, the historical record feels less tragic and more selective. It preserves what insisted on remaining, not what knew when to move on. Thinking this way requires humility. It asks us to accept that visibility is not truth, that evidence reflects bias, that knowledge sometimes survives best by avoiding display. The civilizations that did not stay may have been sophisticated beyond our measure precisely because they refused to be measured. As this idea settles, the question shifts. If disappearance could be intentional, then permanence was not inevitable. It was chosen, and that choice deserves examination. Why did humanity eventually commit to staying, knowing the cost? Why did accumulation win over adaptation? These questions open the final movement of the story, where motivation replaces mystery and silence gives way to reflection on why the weight of permanence was finally embraced, reshaping the human path forever. Power does not always arrive with a voice. Often it settles in quietly, shaped by routine rather than command. When people coordinate their lives long enough, expectation forms. Tasks are done at certain times, resources are accessed in certain ways, movement follows patterns that feel sensible. Over time, these expectations harden. What once felt optional begins to feel required. No one announces this shift. Obligation does not need a declaration to exist. It grows from repetition. When behavior becomes predictable, deviation becomes noticeable. Noticeability invites correction, sometimes spoken, often implied. The pressure to conform does not feel like force. It feels like alignment. Authority emerges not as a figure, but as atmosphere. This is power without a face. It lives in patterns rather than people. It guides choices without instruction. Individuals comply, not because they are compelled, but because alternatives feel disruptive. When coordination works, it rewards conformity. Stability feels good. Predictability reduces effort. Over time, internal agreement replaces external enforcement. The unsettling realization is that the most influential forms of power rarely announce themselves. They feel normal. They hide inside habits, schedules, and expectations that appear natural. When everyone moves in the same direction, guidance becomes invisible. There is no moment where consent is requested. Participation happens gradually, until it feels inevitable. As systems grow, authority becomes distributed. No single person holds it, yet everyone reinforces it. Each small act of compliance strengthens the pattern. Each adjustment made to fit expectation deepens obligation. Power no longer needs to impose itself. It sustains itself through routine. This does not begin with domination. It begins with coordination. People align to reduce friction. Rules appear only when patterns fail. Most guidance remains implicit. Over time, these quiet signals shape behavior more effectively than commands ever could. Authority thrives in familiarity. The shift from external structure to internal compliance is subtle. What once required reminder becomes instinct. Individuals police themselves to avoid disruption. Responsibility replaces freedom without being named. The cost feels minor at first. The benefit feels immediate. This kind of power is difficult to resist because it does not feel imposed. It feels reasonable. Questioning it requires effort. Change introduces uncertainty. Stability discourages examination. Over generations, these patterns harden further. Those born within them rarely see them as constructed. By the time authority becomes visible, it already feels old. It carries the weight of tradition, not decision. The past seems to approve of it simply because it endures, and endurance feels legitimate. As authority settles into everyday life, new roles begin to form around it. Those who understand patterns best learn how to interpret them. Some voices grow steadier than others. The story now turns toward these interpreters, toward the individuals who begin speaking not as creators of authority, but as its representatives. They do not invent rules. They translate what already feels inevitable. By naming patterns, they give them shape. By explaining repetition, they give it meaning. The authority they carry does not feel new. It feels inherited. Because it is familiar, it is trusted. And because it is trusted, it grows. Over time, interpretation becomes guidance. Guidance becomes expectation. Expectation becomes obligation. In this way, power acquires direction without ever declaring intent. What began as coordination now begins shaping belief. People adjust themselves in advance, anticipating what will be required. Choice narrows quietly. Freedom does not vanish, it negotiates. Life becomes easier in some ways, heavier in others. The weight is rarely noticed at first. It feels like responsibility, like maturity, like belonging. This is the moment where authority stops being external and becomes internal. It no longer needs enforcement. It lives in anticipation, in habit, in the desire to remain aligned. And once alignment becomes identity, questioning feels like disruption not only of order, but of self. From here, authority no longer needs a face. It has many voices, all echoing the same patterns, preparing the ground for those who will soon claim to speak, not just for order, but for the past itself. This transition completes the shift from habit to hierarchy, opening the path toward figures who will formalize authority by interpreting memory, belief, and tradition. These voices will soon become indistinguishable from power itself alone. As patterns hardened and authority settled into routine, a new role emerged quietly. Someone began explaining why things were done a certain way. At first, this explanation felt helpful. In growing communities, memory no longer lived evenly in every person. Experience was fragmented. Coordination required reference. The past became useful as guide, and someone had to translate it. These early interpreters did not claim invention. They claimed continuity. They spoke as bridges between what had been done before and what needed to be done now. Their authority did not come from command, but from familiarity. They remembered stories others had forgotten, or at least remembered how those stories were usually told. This made them steady points in an increasingly complex world. At first, their role was descriptive. They explained why certain paths were followed, why rituals happened when they did, why boundaries existed. Explanation reduced uncertainty. It made routine feel reasonable. But over time, explanation shifted. When alternatives appeared, the past was no longer just referenced. It was invoked. This was a subtle turn. When someone claimed to speak for ancestors, for tradition, or for gods, disagreement changed tone. Arguing against an individual is easy. Arguing against the past feels different. The present hesitates. The past carries weight because it cannot respond. It appears settled. Its silence feels authoritative. These voices did not need to fabricate memory. They selected it. Certain stories were repeated because they supported stability. Others faded because they invited disruption. Interpretation became curation. Curation became justification. What had once been guidance slowly hardened into rule, not through force, but through familiarity. Claiming the past proved powerful because the past appeared impartial. It belonged to everyone and no one at once. Speaking for it felt neutral, even when it was not. Authority wrapped itself in history, not to deceive, but to endure. What sounded ancient felt trustworthy. What felt timeless seemed correct. This process did not create villains. It created stewards. Interpreters often believed in the memories they carried. Their confidence came from repetition, not ambition. But belief does not cancel consequence. When the past is spoken by a few, it begins to narrow. When it narrows, it guides behavior more rigidly. Over generations, these voices gained stability. Their interpretations survived longer than personal experience. The role itself became inherited. New interpreters learned old explanations. The words changed slightly, but the position remained. Speaking for the past became a responsibility that carried influence without needing to seek it. The reveal here is quiet but sharp. Control does not need to announce itself as control. When actions are justified by memory, resistance feels like disrespect. When tradition explains behavior, questioning feels dangerous. Authority gains strength not because it forbids change, but because it frames change as violation. This mechanism reshaped societies deeply. Decisions began leaning backward for validation. Innovation required approval from memory. The past stopped being resource and became reference point. It no longer moved with life. Life adjusted to it. Yet this arrangement felt stabilizing. It reduced conflict. It aligned behavior. It offered continuity across generations. The cost was subtle. Experience slowly lost authority to interpretation. Those who lived conditions could be overruled by those who remembered them differently. As interpreters solidified their role, memory grew less flexible. Stories gained structure. Symbols gained meaning. Language itself shifted to preserve consistency. What could be spoken for could be written down. And here the story edges toward another transformation. Once memory could be fixed, not just spoken, authority no longer needed living voices alone. It could survive their absence. With that shift, the past would become permanent, no longer carried by people, but by marks that resisted forgetting. This transition did not feel like loss. It felt like security. Writing promised preservation without dependence on fragile memory. But permanence would change the balance again. The next step in this journey leads into the moment when memory ceased to rely on human carriers at all, and authority learned to outlast its interpreters. When writing appeared, it did not announce itself as revolution. It arrived quietly, as assistance. Marks were made to remember counts, exchanges, seasons, promises. At first, nothing seemed to change. Speech continued. Ritual remained. Memory still lived in bodies and gatherings. Writing simply waited nearby, holding fragments that no one wanted to lose. But writing carried a difference that was not immediately visible. Spoken memory exists only while it is carried. Written memory persists without consent. Once a mark is made, it no longer requires renewal through experience. It can remain unchanged while the world around it shifts. Time, for the first time, could be paused. This pause altered the balance of memory. What was written did not need to adapt. It did not need to respond to context. It could be returned to exactly as it was. Precision replaced relevance. Permanence replaced responsiveness. The past stopped traveling with people and began waiting for them instead. This transformation felt empowering. Writing promised continuity beyond the fragile limits of life. Knowledge could survive death. Agreements could extend beyond trust. Laws could persist without conversation. Memory could be carried farther than any individual voice. What had once relied on participation now relied on preservation. Yet with this preservation came distance. Written memory no longer belonged to those who lived it. It belonged to the text. Experience could not change it easily. Interpretation replaced participation. Meaning slowed, then settled. The present began negotiating with records rather than remembering for itself. This did not diminish writing's value. It expanded reach. It stabilized complexity. Large systems require reference points that outlast individuals. Writing allowed coordination across time and space. It enabled continuity at scales that living memory could not support. Civilization depended on it. But writing did not merely support civilization. It reshaped it. Once memory could exist independently of people, authority changed form. A law no longer needed agreement each time it was applied. A belief no longer needed to be felt to persist. An instruction no longer needed a teacher to survive. The written word carries authority because it appears settled. It does not argue. It does not change tone. It does not age. When disagreements arise, writing feels impartial. Its endurance suggests correctness. Its silence feels final. What is written gains weight simply by remaining. This is where time itself transformed. The past stopped being something encountered. It became something consulted. Written records allowed the past to reach forward unchanged, shaping decisions long after the conditions that produced it had vanished. Memory gained leverage over experience. Beliefs could now outlast belief. A ritual written down could continue even when its meaning faded. A rule preserved in text could govern generations who never agreed to it. Authority no longer needed to be embodied. It could reside in marks. The hypnotic danger of writing lies in its stillness. What does not change feels reliable. What endures feels important. Over time, stability becomes mistaken for truth. The written past acquires gravity. The present bends toward it. This shift did not erase living memory instantly. For a long time, spoken and written memory coexisted. But gradually, writing gained preference. It was easier to reference, easier to defend, easier to preserve. Over generations, what was written shaped what was remembered. The moment time became written, it stopped belonging entirely to the living. It began belonging to systems that could survive their creators, systems that could expand without renegotiation, systems that could forget context while maintaining form. This threshold marks the dividing line. On one side, memory moved. It adapted, responded, dissolved, reformed. On the other, memory fixed itself into history. What followed would feel clearer, louder, more structured. But clarity came with narrowing. Much that did not fit writing's form slipped away quietly. With writing established, history begins in the familiar sense. Names appear, dates anchor events, authority finds permanence, but something else vanishes in the process. Entire ways of knowing fall outside record. The story now crosses fully into written time, where presence is replaced by documentation and absence becomes harder to recognize. And so the question shifts again. Not what writing gave us, but what it quietly displaced. As attention moves forward into recorded history, it also turns backward, searching the margins for what writing could not carry with it, and what was left behind when time learned how to stand still. For most of human existence, memory did not stand still. It shifted with circumstance, reshaped by necessity, adjusted as environments changed. Remembering was not about keeping the past intact. It was about making the past useful. Stories altered slightly each time they were told, not because they were unreliable, but because relevance mattered more than precision. What no longer applied was released. What still worked was carried forward. When permanence entered human life, this balance began to change. Staying in one place long enough meant returning to the same stories, the same explanations, the same answers. Memory no longer needed to be renewed through movement. It could be stored, repeated, protected. At first, this felt like security. Knowledge could survive beyond the living moment. Experience no longer vanished when conditions shifted. Something stable could be held. But stability altered the function of memory. What was once responsive became referential. Stories stopped bending to context and began pointing backward instead. Traditions that once adapted to seasons were repeated as instruction. The past was no longer entered, it was consulted. Remembering shifted from participation to preservation. This change was gentle. It did not arrive as force. It felt necessary. When communities grew larger and life became more complex, consistency mattered. Shared memory reduced conflict. Repetition created unity. Fixed stories helped groups coordinate across time. Preservation felt like care rather than control. Yet something subtle occurred. When memory is preserved rather than lived, it separates from experience. It begins to exist outside the body, meaning shifts from use to accuracy. The question changes from, does this still work, to, is this how it has always been done? That difference is small, but its consequences grow. Once memory stops moving, it can be protected. Once protected, it can be guarded. And once guarded, it can be claimed. Fixed memory allows certain versions of the past to persist even when conditions change. Over time, those versions gain authority simply because they endure. What is old begins to feel correct. What is repeated begins to feel true. This does not require deception. Authority enters quietly, carried by consistency. When memory remains fluid, no one owns it. Everyone adjusts it through use. When memory hardens, fewer voices shape it. Those who preserve it gain influence without seeking it. Experience begins to answer to memory rather than guide it. The tender discomfort here is realizing that this shift was not a mistake. It was an adaptation to permanence. Large groups need shared reference. Stability requires agreement. Memory had to stop moving for civilization to function at scale. But in doing so, memory lost its flexibility. It became something that could outlast experience, rather than reflect it. Over generations, fixed memory grows heavier. It accumulates. It resists change. New experiences are measured against it, rather than integrated into it. Innovation becomes deviation. Adaptation becomes threat. The past begins to shape the present more than the present reshapes the past. This is the quiet turning point. When memory moves, it belongs to everyone. When it stops, it begins to belong somewhere. That belonging may feel abstract at first, but it creates advantage. Those who interpret memory, preserve it, and repeat it gain a role. Memory becomes something that can be referenced, defended, and eventually enforced. At this stage, history is no longer only record. It becomes leverage. Fixed memory can justify choices, settle disputes, establish expectations. Experience alone cannot argue against it. What happened before carries more weight than what is happening now. This is where the story begins to narrow. Not abruptly, but steadily. Memory that once flowed through bodies and places now rests in forms that resist change. The past becomes less accessible, but more powerful. And as this power grows, attention naturally shifts away from memory itself and toward those who begin deciding which memories endure. As communities expanded, memory faced a quiet limitation. Not everything could be carried forward. When life was small and movement constant, stories adjusted naturally. But permanence brought accumulation, and accumulation demanded selection. Some memories were repeated because they felt useful. Others faded because repeating them required effort that no longer fit crowded lives. No one decided what would be forgotten. Forgetting happened through ease. Repetition became the filter. Stories told often stayed familiar. Familiarity created comfort. Comfort bred legitimacy. Over time, what was repeated most became what felt correct. Not because it was truer, but because it was heard. Memory did not disappear violently. It thinned, shaped by what communities could carry without strain. As structure increased, memory required organization. Too many stories caused friction. Agreement required simplification. The past began to settle into versions that supported continuity rather than complexity. Stories that aligned with stability were easier to keep. Stories that challenged it required explanation. Those explanations became inconvenient. Gradually, certain accounts stopped circulating. This process did not require intent. Convenience shaped memory more effectively than force. When roles emerged, certain voices naturally repeated certain stories. These voices gained consistency through position rather than power. Over time, their versions of the past carried further, simply because they were always present. Legitimacy grew from exposure. What people heard since childhood felt foundational. Alternatives sounded foreign. Competing memories did not disappear entirely. They survived quietly, carried by fewer voices, passed along unevenly. But without reinforcement, they lost influence. Memory narrowed not through suppression, but through imbalance. As generations passed, remembered versions solidified. What had once been flexible became reference. When disputes arose, people turned to what was remembered most clearly. The past began to settle disagreements rather than inform them. Accuracy mattered less than stability. Shared memory became anchor. This is where history quietly diverges from truth. not through deception, but structure. Systems require coherence. Coherence favors repetition. Repetition favors simplicity. Over time, the past that survives reflects what fit best within growing order. This realization carries weight. History feels authoritative because it appears complete, but completeness is impression, not fact. What remains visible represents alignment, not totality. The silence around forgotten stories is not empty, it is shaped. Remembering becomes privilege without intention. Those positioned to repeat stories often become the guardians of the past, not because they seek control, but because others rely on consistency. Memory becomes something that can be referred to, defended, invoked. Yet this process carries no villain. Structural forgetting is neutral. It responds to scale, to time, to limitation. But its effect is profound. What we inherit as history often reflects who was heard most often, not who understood best. This awareness does not demand rejection of memory. It invites caution. Knowing that memory is shaped by repetition rather than accuracy softens certainty. It creates space for humility. It reminds us that what we know of the past is shaped as much by structure as by experience. As selective memory settles, it seeks reinforcement. Words alone are fragile. To stabilize chosen narratives, something more durable begins to form. Symbols appear, stories gain ritual, belief steps in not to deceive, but to hold memory still. And with belief, memory finds a new anchor, preparing the ground for the next transformation. As memory settled into fixed forms, it needed reinforcement. Stories alone could fade. Repetition helped, but repetition without feeling weakened over time. In growing communities, something was required to hold memory in place, to give it weight beyond instruction. This is where belief emerged, not as invention, but as response. Belief did not begin as explanation. It began as attachment. Shared stories were wrapped in emotion so they would endure. Ritual added rhythm. Symbol added focus. Together, they transformed memory from information into experience. What was believed was not merely recalled, it was felt. Feeling made memory resilient. In this way, belief acted as anchor. It prevented cultural drift by tying memory to meaning. When stories became sacred, changing them felt dangerous. When rituals marked time, memory repeated itself without question. Growing populations needed consistency more than accuracy. Belief provided stability when personal experience could no longer do so. This stability was not deceptive. It was practical. Large groups cannot renegotiate meaning constantly. Agreement requires continuity. Belief systems offered a shared foundation when living memory became fragmented. They held memory still long enough for permanence to feel safe. Rituals reinforced this process quietly. By repeating actions at set times, memory became embodied again, though in prescribed form. Symbols condensed complex histories into simple shapes. Language shifted from descriptive to declarative. Meaning was affirmed rather than tested. This did not erase insight, it redirected it. The twist lies here. Belief did not emerge to answer questions about existence. It emerged to answer questions about consistency. As societies expanded, instability threatened cohesion. Belief stabilized by reducing variability. It aligned individuals with shared pasts, even if those pasts were simplified. Over time, belief gained authority because it endured. What survived repeated ritual felt timeless. Timelessness felt true. Memory wrapped in belief stopped moving, protected from reinterpretation. This protection allowed societies to function, but it also narrowed possibility. Yet belief was not imposed from above. It was reinforced from within. Participation created commitment. Commitment created identity. Identity reinforced belief. This cycle did not require force. It required repetition and meaning. In this framework, spirituality is not dismissed. It is contextualized. Belief offered comfort, orientation, and belonging. It made permanence bearable. It allowed memory to persist beyond individual lives. But it also fixed meaning, where once it flowed. As belief anchored memory, it prepared ground for something else. Once stories carried authority, those who interpreted them gained influence. Stability created roles. roles created hierarchy. And from belief anchored in memory, authority would begin to rise, not as domination, but as stewardship. The story now moves forward into that transformation, where stabilized memory quietly shapes power itself. Written history feels complete because it exists at all. Once marks appear, silence seems to vanish, replaced by names, dates, and sequences that suggest total recall. The presence of record creates authority automatically. What is written feels settled, finished, trustworthy. Yet this confidence comes not from accuracy, but from visibility. Writing fills space quickly, giving the impression that the past has been fully captured, when in reality, only certain moments were ever eligible to remain. Early records did not aim to document life as it was lived. They focused on what needed tracking: harvests, exchanges, boundaries, victories. Writing followed power, not experience. What could be counted, taxed, enforced, or celebrated earned space. What was fluid, ordinary, or dispersed rarely did. This selectivity was practical, not deceitful. Records were tools, not mirrors. They simplified complexity, so large systems could function without constant negotiation. This efficiency made expansion possible, but narrowed memory. As writing spread, the past appeared fuller than it truly was. Gaps vanished behind ink, events gained edges, while silence lost meaning. The absence of record began to look like absence of life. But most lives were never meant to be recorded. They unfolded in repetition, adaptation, and local knowledge that resisted standardization. Writing did not forget them by accident. It was never built to hold them. Its structure favored stability over responsiveness across time. Completeness is an illusion created by continuity. When records stretch unbroken, they imply wholeness. Yet continuity often reflects persistence, not relevance. A practice recorded for centuries appears foundational, even if it no longer fits lived conditions. Writing preserves what stays consistent, not what stays effective. Over generations, this bias compounds. The past hardens into a simplified shape, convincing precisely because it remains unchanged. What disappears is variation, adjustment, and the memory of alternatives once present. Because records feel complete, they discourage questioning. Few ask what had to vanish for such clarity to appear. Writing rewards what conforms to its limits. Centralized societies write more, preserve more, and dominate the record. Dispersed cultures leave lighter traces. Over time, history skews towards stability, authority, and scale. What survives appears important. What adapts quietly seems invisible, despite shaping far more lives than monuments, archives, or celebrated events ever could when viewed closely alone. This realization reframes written history. It is not wrong, but partial. It records what could stay still long enough to be noticed. What moved differently passed through its net. Silence did not mean nothing happened. It meant nothing fit the format. History remembers strategically, guided by what writing can carry, and what systems choose to maintain. Understanding this opens space to ask who vanished first when writing began, and why absence followed certain lives consistently. Once this illusion loosens, history feels thinner. Its surface looks solid, but beneath it stretches unrecorded time. The names and dates remain valuable, yet they no longer pretend to stand for everything. What feels complete is revealed as a selective layer, preserving what aligned with endurance, control, and celebration, while ordinary existence slipped quietly beyond the page. This thinness is not weakness, but an invitation to look deeper without certainty, comfort, or final answers remaining. Recognizing incompleteness does not erase the past, it restores proportion. Written history becomes one voice among many, rather than the only witness. This awareness softens authority without rejecting knowledge. It allows space for possibility. The past grows wider, not clearer, and within that width, new questions surface about whose lives faded first, when memory learned how to write itself. These questions mark the next quiet turn in the story, guiding attention toward disappearance and silence. As completeness dissolves, attention shifts toward loss without drama. Not collapse, but filtering. Not erasure, but narrowing. The record feels louder, precisely because it excludes so much. What disappears first are lives lived beyond administration, beyond celebration, beyond control. The next step is to follow that disappearance and notice who history leaves behind once writing begins choosing what matters. Their absence prepares the ground for deeper understanding of silence as signal, not void or failure. This shift completes a subtle reframing. History no longer appears finished. It becomes selective, shaped by what writing could hold and power could manage. With this awareness, curiosity deepens rather than resolves. The story moves onward, not toward answers, but toward those who slip through record first, quietly preparing the way for examining disappearance as pattern rather than accident in the next chapter ahead, where silence grows intentional and revealing instead of empty and ignored. Not every society aimed to endure in stone. Some moved deliberately, lightly, leaving little behind because staying was never the goal. These cultures did not collapse. They completed themselves, again and again, through renewal rather than accumulation. From the perspective of written history, they appear to vanish. In reality, they continued by refusing to harden. Mobility was not a limitation for these societies, it was an intelligence. Movement allowed responsiveness to climate, resources, and conflict. When pressure increased, departure prevented collapse. When conditions shifted, adaptation replaced defense. By avoiding permanence, these cultures avoided the weight that permanence demands. They did not need walls, archives, or monuments to persist. Their survival depended on timing, knowledge, and restraint. This absence can feel unsettling because it contradicts modern expectations. We associate complexity with visibility. We trust what leaves ruins. Yet many lifeways were designed to dissolve their own traces. Camps were dismantled. Structures decayed intentionally. Tools were light, shared, replaceable. Knowledge lived in practice, not storage. Nothing needed to remain once its purpose ended. From the outside, this can resemble fragility. In truth, it reflects confidence. A culture that does not fear disappearance does not cling to form. It understands continuity differently. Survival is measured across generations, not places. Memory is carried forward through bodies, relationships, and rhythm, rather than preserved objects. The historical record struggles with this kind of success. Writing rewards endurance, not fluency. It captures what insists on remaining. Cultures that pass through landscapes quietly leave little for history to hold. Their disappearance is not evidence of failure, only of incompatibility with record. Silence, in this case, is structural. Many such societies likely lasted longer than those remembered for their ruins. They avoided ecological strain by moving with seasons. They reduced inequality by limiting accumulation. They diffused power by refusing fixed hierarchies. These choices did not produce monuments. They produced resilience. The twist lies here. Survival and visibility are not the same. What we call lost may have lasted longest. What we call ancient may simply have stayed still. The measure of success depends on the measure we choose. History prefers what it can point to. It overlooks what learned how to remain light. This reframing alters how loss is felt. Disappearance no longer signals collapse, it signals release. Some cultures ended cycles deliberately, preventing rigidity from setting in. They disappeared before permanence could trap them. Their continuity required no trace, only continuation. This does not romanticize absence. It recognizes intention. Avoiding permanence demands discipline. It requires resisting accumulation and accepting impermanence. It demands constant attention to balance. These are not simple choices. They reflect deep understanding of trade-offs that permanence brings. Silence, then, becomes meaningful. Where no ruins stand, there may still be lineage. Where no names remain, patterns persist. Movement leaves influence without debris. These cultures reshaped landscapes gently and then withdrew, leaving environments capable of renewal rather than strain. As this understanding settles, the historical record feels less like a neutral archive and more like a filter. Only certain kinds of societies pass through it. Others slip beneath, not because they lack depth, but because they refuse to be fixed. Once disappearance is seen as strategic, another question arises. If some cultures vanished by design, how did others come to dominate memory? What forces ensured that endurance, rather than adaptation, became the measure of importance? The story now turns toward the quiet mechanisms that favored certain histories while letting others pass unseen, shaping what survives, not by truth alone, but by structure. In this moment, absence feels heavier than presence. What remains unrecorded presses gently against certainty. The past grows more complex, not less. And as the audience sits with that complexity, the path forward becomes clear. To understand why some histories persist, one must examine the systems that rewarded staying, recording, and control. Those systems did not emerge by accident. They formed quietly, shaping the archive long before anyone noticed its bias. With that awareness, the narrative advances toward the forces that selected memory over motion, permanence over renewal, and presence over silence, revealing how history learned to favor some lives while letting others fade without a trace at all. History does not remember movement well. It struggles to hold what refuses to stay. Writing favors stillness, not because it chooses to, but because stillness allows accumulation. Archives grow where life remains anchored. Records depend on return, repetition, and location. Mobility interrupts all three. When people move often, memory stays light. When they stay, memory piles up. Stability makes writing possible at scale. A settled society can store documents, protect them, copy them, and pass them forward. Continuity becomes visible. Adaptation, by contrast, resists capture. When ways of living change quickly, when locations shift, when systems dissolve before hardening, record-keeping falters. Writing loses its reference point. Memory moves faster than inscription. Over time, this creates a distortion. Histories begin to reflect not what shaped humanity most deeply, but what remained in place long enough to be documented. Centralized societies dominate the record because they persist physically. Their documents accumulate, their structures resist change, their memory thickens. Meanwhile, societies that adapt fluidly, relocate easily, or dissolve intentionally leave faint impressions. Their influence spreads outward, but their presence fades. This bias feels invisible because it is structural. No one decides which cultures deserve history. The archive selects automatically. It gathers where conditions allow it to gather. What survives feels important simply because it survives. Endurance becomes mistaken for significance. As centuries pass, this distortion compounds. Stability reinforces itself. Recorded societies appear foundational. Unrecorded ones feel peripheral or non-existent. The past begins to look more uniform than it was. Variation disappears behind continuity. What remains visible appears inevitable. This realization alters how power is understood. History is not only written by victors, it is written by those who stop moving. A culture does not need to conquer to dominate memory. It needs to remain legible. Writing rewards permanence over responsiveness. What stays still long enough becomes reference. What adapts dissolves from view. This does not mean stability is wrong. It allows complexity, scale, and long coordination. But it shapes memory in a particular way. It privileges structures that resist change. Over time, history begins to resemble those structures. The past feels rigid because the record favors rigidity. The calm danger of this bias lies in how natural it feels. Few question it because it does not announce itself. Written history looks like a mirror. In reality, it is a lens. It magnifies some shapes while shrinking others. What is magnified gains authority. What is minimized appears irrelevant. Living inside this narrowed past affects perception. When history appears dominated by centralized systems, alternatives feel unrealistic. When endurance is mistaken for success, flexibility seems fragile. The record trains expectation without declaring it. As this awareness settles, certainty softens. The past grows less definitive, more selective. What we know becomes contextual rather than absolute. History remains valuable, but incomplete by design. With this understanding, attention prepares to turn inward. The question shifts from what history records to how living inside such a record shapes identity, memory, and belief. The consequences of this narrowing are not only historical, they are psychological. And it is into that quiet consequence that the story now moves. Forgetting rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as rupture or disappearance. It settles gradually, like a climate rather than an event. Each generation steps into a version of the past already shaped, already trimmed for coherence. What remains is arranged neatly enough to feel whole. What is missing is difficult to sense because nothing seems absent. The story appears complete. From early life, names, dates, and explanations form a framework that feels natural. There is no indication that alternatives once existed. The past is presented as sequence rather than selection. When knowledge arrives already ordered, questioning feels unnecessary. Absence hides inside structure. Silence blends into background. This is how forgetting becomes normal. It does not feel like loss. It feels like clarity. Complexity dissolves into simplicity, and simplicity feels reassuring. When conflicting possibilities vanish, what remains gains confidence. Certainty grows where variation once lived. The mind prefers coherence to contradiction, and edited memory provides exactly that. Over time, this condition deepens. Each retelling reinforces the same outline. Each repetition smooths remaining edges. What no longer fits the shape fades quietly. Without reference, curiosity softens. If something is not named, it stops being asked about. Forgetting happens without resistance because there is nothing to push against. This process produces comfort. A narrowed past feels manageable. It offers direction and identity without demanding effort. Doubt becomes unnecessary when explanation appears sufficient. The story holds together. That cohesion feels like truth, even when it reflects absence more than presence. The subtle twist lies here. Forgetting does not feel disorienting. It feels grounding. When information disappears gradually, it leaves behind a stronger sense of order. The gaps are invisible because nothing points to them. The mind accepts what is presented as complete because it has no reason to imagine otherwise. This condition shapes expectation. When the past appears straightforward, the future feels predictable. Alternatives seem unrealistic. Change feels disruptive rather than exploratory. Stability becomes the default measure of success. What once existed outside the record no longer registers as possibility. Living inside a shortened history reshapes perception quietly. The past begins where the record begins. Everything before becomes vague, distant, unreal. Depth is replaced by clarity. Uncertainty gives way to explanation. An explanation feels like understanding. The soothing quality of this forgetting is what makes it powerful. It does not threaten identity, it supports it. By offering a clean lineage, it allows belonging without ambiguity. The cost is subtle. When complexity disappears, sensitivity narrows. The ability to imagine different ways of being fades without notice. This is not imposed forgetting. It is inherited. Each generation receives a past already simplified. The act of remembering becomes passive. There is nothing to reconstruct, only facts to learn. Memory shifts from exploration to acceptance. As this condition settles, questions change. Instead of asking what is missing, attention turns to what remains. The past feels settled, silence feels natural, forgetting feels like peace. And it is this peace that reshapes identity. When history feels complete, identity roots itself in what is visible. What survives becomes foundational. What vanishes becomes unthinkable. As forgetting becomes familiar, its effects deepen beyond memory. They extend into how people understand themselves and their place in time. The story now moves toward that inward shift, where a narrowed past begins quietly shaping identity, belief, and certainty itself. This quiet narrowing rarely triggers alarm. There is no moment of realization, no awareness that something has slipped away. Life continues, explanations hold, traditions feel intact. Forgetting blends seamlessly into learning. What is taught feels sufficient, so curiosity rests. Over time, even the idea of loss disappears. Absence becomes ordinary, indistinguishable from completeness. And in that ordinariness, the missing past stops asking to be remembered at all. This is why forgetting rarely provokes grief. It does not remove something held, it prevents something from forming. Without contrast, there is no sense of reduction. The past feels solid precisely because its edges are gone. What cannot be compared cannot be missed. And so, forgetting continues, gently, almost kindly, shaping awareness while asking nothing in return from those who live within it. This softened certainty prepares the ground for identity to grow inside narrowed memory next moments ahead. Identity grows from stories. Long before facts are questioned, origins are learned. They arrive early, wrapped in language that feels stable and complete. These stories do not need to be detailed. They need only to feel sufficient. When the past is presented as settled, identity anchors itself there without hesitation. But when the past is partial, identity is built on fragments. What remains visible becomes foundation. What is missing leaves no outline. The story still functions, but it rests on assumption rather than continuity. Belonging forms without context. Meaning settles without depth. Nations do this instinctively. They trace themselves to beginnings that feel decisive, moments that can be named and celebrated. Complexity is reduced so identity can feel clear. Cultures adopt simplified origins, not to deceive, but to cohere. Individuals do the same. Family histories condense, stories soften at the edges. What is forgotten leaves behind confidence rather than doubt. This confidence feels reassuring. Knowing where one comes from answers questions before they are asked. It provides place and direction. But certainty built on fragments carries a quiet vulnerability. When identity is anchored in simplified memory, it lacks elasticity. It resists contradiction, because contradiction threatens belonging. The twist here is personal. Inherited certainty often replaces inherited understanding. People receive conclusions without process. They know what to believe, but not how those beliefs formed. Identity feels strong because it is unexamined. Strength comes from familiarity, not resilience. This does not suggest identity is false. It suggests it is incomplete. The absence of deeper memory narrows the range of self-recognition. People recognize themselves in the stories they are given, not the full span of influences that shape them. When something feels missing, it is hard to name because no reference exists. A shortened past offers clarity at a cost. It makes identity easier to maintain, but harder to adapt. When the world shifts, rigid identity strains. Without awareness of earlier variation, change feels threatening. The self holds tightly to what it knows, mistaking familiarity for truth. This fragility rarely shows itself immediately. It waits. It appears when beliefs are challenged, when alternative stories surface. Defensive reactions arise not from weakness, but from uncertainty hidden beneath confidence. Identity resists expansion, because expansion feels like loss. Yet this condition is widespread because it works. Societies function better when identity feels stable. Individuals move forward more easily when belonging is clear. The price is subtle. Depth is exchanged for certainty. Continuity is replaced by assumption. Turning the lens inward reveals this exchange gently. When asked who we are, we often answer with fragments, names, places, milestones. Rarely do we feel the full depth of time behind those answers. The missing pieces do not announce themselves. They remain silent, shaping perception without being acknowledged. This silence creates a particular emotional texture, a vague sense that something is incomplete, without knowing what. A quiet unease that rarely forms into question. Identity holds, but it does not breathe. It remains fixed because it does not know it can expand. Recognizing this does not dissolve identity. It softens it. It introduces space without accusation. Understanding that origins are simplified does not remove belonging. It deepens it. It allows identity to be curious, rather than defensive. As this awareness settles, identity begins to feel less like a statement and more like a process. The self becomes something that can widen, rather than something that must be defended. But before this shift fully arrives, another feeling emerges. When identity rests on fragments, the mind sometimes senses a gap it cannot articulate, a feeling that the story begins too late, that something older is pressing quietly beneath explanation. This sensation does not produce language. It produces discomfort without shape. From here, the story moves toward that psychological edge, toward the subtle experience of knowing something is missing without knowing what it is. That experience becomes the next threshold, where absence stops being intellectual and starts becoming felt. There is a feeling that sits beneath modern understanding of the past, rarely spoken aloud. It is not confusion. It is not doubt in facts or frustration with dates. It is something quieter. A sense that the story begins too suddenly, that humanity appears fully formed without sufficient lead-in, as if something long and formative has been skipped over without explanation. This unease does not arrive as a question. It arrives as intuition. A mild pressure at the edge of awareness, difficult to name and easy to dismiss. Most people sense it only briefly, when a timeline feels too short or an origin story feels too neat. The feeling fades because nothing invites it to stay. There is no language for it, no clear gap to point to. What makes this discomfort unusual is that it does not feel like loss. Loss implies memory of what existed before. This feeling comes without reference. It is the recognition of absence without knowing what is absent. The mind registers something incomplete, but cannot supply the missing piece. This is how missing time is felt emotionally rather than intellectually. The record looks full, names, events, and explanations are present, yet something feels compressed. The past seems to start mid-sentence. The intuition arises that much has happened before the moment we are allowed to see. This sensation is not accidental. It emerges from living inside a shortened history. When memory has been filtered for coherence, what remains feels sufficient, but depth quietly disappears. The mind adapts to clarity. It learns not to ask beyond the given frame, but intuition retains sensitivity. It notices when proportions feel wrong. The discomfort remains subtle because there is no contradiction to confront. The story functions, life continues, identity holds. Questioning the past does not feel urgent. And yet, beneath explanation, something presses gently, insisting without words that more exists than what is named. This sensation often surfaces in moments of stillness, late at night, in silence. When the mind relaxes its grip on certainty, it can feel like curiosity tinged with unease, or wonder mixed with disquiet. It does not demand resolution. It waits. Importantly, this feeling does not ask to be solved. It asks to be recognized. When dismissed, it recedes. When allowed, it opens perception slightly. It shifts attention from answers to awareness, from explanation to presence. The twist here is deeply human. We do not sense missing time through analysis. We sense it through feeling. Just as memory once lived in bodies before it lived in records, this intuition bypasses logic and speaks through sensation. It is ancient in that way, responding to absence as something felt rather than proven. Modern culture often teaches us to ignore such feelings. What cannot be explained is considered unimportant. What cannot be verified is treated as distraction. Yet, intuition remains one of the oldest ways humans have engaged with time. Long before history was written, people sensed continuity through rhythm, pattern, and absence. This quiet discomfort does not accuse history of being wrong. It simply refuses to believe it is complete. It asks for space rather than correction. When allowed to linger, it changes how time feels. The past grows wider. The present feels less final. Certainty loosens without collapsing. The calm pacing of this moment matters. Rushing to explain would break the effect. This is a threshold, not a conclusion. The feeling does not resolve because resolution would reduce it to concept. Its power lies in remaining felt, rather than defined. As the audience rests with this sensation, something begins to shift. Prehistory no longer feels like a distant before. It feels like an influence still present, shaping perception quietly. The question moves away from what was lost and toward what still operates unseen. This discomfort becomes an invitation, not to recover forgotten timelines, but to notice how deeply the unseen past continues to inform behavior, instinct, and imagination. What feels missing may not be gone at all. It may be active, unrecognized, woven into patterns too familiar to notice. With this awareness, the journey reaches a turning point. The past is no longer something behind us. It becomes something moving through us. And from this place of quiet unease, the final phase begins, where prehistory is no longer examined as absence, but as presence shaping the world that followed. Modern life often feels separate from its origins. Glass, code, and concrete suggest distance from soil and fire. Yet beneath these surfaces, older patterns continue to move, shaping behavior without asking for recognition. Prehistory did not end. It settled into habit, Humans still gather. The form has changed, but the instinct remains. Crowds assemble around shared attention, drawn together by sound, light, and promise. These gatherings echo firesides where safety was once found in proximity. Being near others still signals protection, even when danger has changed shape. The body remembers what the mind no longer names. Boundaries persist as well. Lines are drawn, defended, respected. Territory no longer takes the form of hunting ground or shelter, yet the urge to mark space remains strong. Homes, offices, nations all repeat an ancient pattern. Inside means belonging, outside means uncertainty. These divisions feel logical, but their roots stretch back to survival rather than policy. Time, too, follows inherited rhythm. Schedules appear modern, but they mirror migrations. Work weeks compress effort into cycles of movement and rest. Holidays cluster around seasons, once tied to harvest, scarcity, or renewal. Even without knowing why, people feel the pull of repetition. The calendar replaces the horizon, but rhythm remains. Ritual has not vanished, it has shifted location. Repeated actions give structure to days, weeks, lives. Morning routines, ceremonies, shared signals all serve the same purpose they once did. Aligning individuals within a group. Ritual reduces uncertainty. It tells the body what comes next. Meaning follows repetition, not explanation. Cities themselves echo ancient camps. Paths converge at centers. Resources cluster. Shelter surrounds points of exchange. Even towering structures follow patterns shaped by density, visibility, and access. Modern environments feel designed, yet they often emerge from the same pressures that once shaped temporary settlements. The difference is scale, not instinct. Social behavior carries similar inheritance. Trust forms through repetition. Suspicion arises from unfamiliarity. Cooperation strengthens under shared risk. These responses evolved long before written law. Modern systems refine them, regulate them, but rarely erase them. The past persists quietly in how people react before they reason. The twist here is gentle. Modernity did not replace prehistoric life. It reorganized it. Ancient patterns were not discarded, they were layered over. New technologies changed surroundings, but the body continues responding as if conditions are older than they appear. The environment updates faster than instinct. This realization feels personal because it lives inside everyday choices. What feels natural often has deep roots. The comfort of routine, the pull of belonging, the anxiety around change all trace back to conditions that shaped survival long before explanation. We do not remember these patterns, we enact them. Understanding this continuity softens the boundary between past and present. Prehistory becomes less distant, more intimate. It is not something behind us, but something expressed through us. Behavior carries memory where records do not. As this awareness settles, attention shifts toward tension. Modern systems do not simply preserve these patterns. They amplify some and suppress others. Certain instincts are rewarded, others are constrained. The question becomes not whether ancient patterns remain, but how current structures shape which ones are allowed expression, and which must remain quiet beneath the surface. These patterns surface most clearly when systems strain. In moments of crisis, people revert to instinct faster than instruction. They gather information from those nearby. They seek familiar roles. They protect space, ration resources, and look for cues of safety. None of this is taught formally. It emerges automatically, carried forward from environments where hesitation meant harm. Modern structures attempt to manage these impulses, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Bureaucracy slows reaction. Technology masks proximity. Yet beneath these layers, ancient responses wait. When systems fail, instincts speak first. Recognizing this does not diminish progress. It clarifies it. Civilization becomes a lens, not a replacement. The deeper story is not how far humanity has moved away from its past, but how consistently it still moves with it. And as these inherited patterns meet modern amplification, a new tension forms, pointing toward the systems that decide which instincts are encouraged and which are silenced, shaping life in ways both visible and unseen. Long-standing forces continue guiding behavior, beyond conscious awareness alone. Civilization feels solid because it surrounds us. Roads, laws, schedules, and institutions create the sense of permanence. They appear stable, engineered, deliberate. Yet this stability is recent when placed against the depth of human behavior. Beneath these systems, older rhythms continue to move, shaping responses long before thought arrives to explain them. Technology gives the impression of mastery. Tools extend reach, compress time, and buffer against uncertainty. But they often act as coverings rather than replacements. The instincts they manage remain intact beneath the surface. Cooperation under pressure emerges automatically. Scarcity triggers anxiety regardless of abundance. Trust forms through repetition, not policy. These responses do not originate in modern systems. They predate them. Law organizes behavior, but it does not generate it. Rules formalize impulses that already exist. Property codifies territorial instinct. Contracts regulate exchange shaped by reciprocity. Even justice reflects ancient patterns of balance and consequence. Civilization refines these forces, but it does not invent them. The older logic remains active, guiding reaction beneath compliance. Structure adds predictability, yet predictability does not erase instinct. Schedules resemble migrations compressed into calendars. Work cycles echo seasonal effort and rest. Holidays follow rhythms, once tied to scarcity and renewal. These patterns feel cultural, but they align closely with biological timing shaped over long survival. The unsettling realization is how thin this surface truly is. What feels advanced depends on constant maintenance. Systems must be powered, enforced, updated, defended. When pressure increases, fragility appears. Technology fails quietly. Law bends under strain. Structure reveals its dependency on cooperation it cannot fully command. By contrast, what feels primitive endures. Instinct adapts instantly. Habit survives disruption. The body responds without instruction. Ancient patterns persist because they are embedded, not constructed. They do not require belief to function. They operate automatically, shaped by conditions that no longer exist, yet still influence behavior. This does not frame civilization as false. It frames it as layered. Civilization is not the opposite of prehistory. It is its surface expression. Underneath regulation, instinct still moves. Beneath identity, belonging still matters. Beneath policy, survival logic still whispers. The calm danger lies in mistaking the surface for the whole. When civilization feels complete, deeper rhythms go unnoticed. People believe systems replaced instinct when they only redirected it. This belief creates vulnerability. When systems falter, individuals are surprised by reactions they assumed were gone. Crowds respond faster than procedures. Fear spreads quicker than information. Cooperation forms in chaos without planning. These responses feel sudden only because they were hidden. They were always present, waiting beneath structure. Recognizing civilization as surface changes perspective. Stability no longer feels guaranteed. It feels negotiated. Systems become agreements rather than absolutes. Their strength depends on alignment with deeper rhythms. When alignment fails, stress appears. This awareness does not demand rejection of modern life. It demands proportion. Civilization becomes a tool rather than an identity. Its limits become visible without becoming threatening. Understanding depth restores flexibility. The body carries memory older than law. Emotion reacts before explanation. Community forms faster than administration. These truths do not undermine progress. They contextualize it. As this realization settles, a question emerges quietly. If civilization is thin, then forgetting that depth carries consequence. Remembering it may change how the future is shaped. The story now turns toward that question, where awareness of depth influences choice, restraint, and adaptation moving forward. Remembering prehistory is not an act of recovery. Nothing needs to be rebuilt, proven, or claimed. What matters is perspective. When time feels short, every decision carries pressure. Choices appear final. Mistakes feel permanent. History compresses responsibility into narrow frames, making the present feel heavier than it needs to be. When time widens, something softens. The present loosens its grip, certainty relaxes. Deep time stretches beyond names and dates, reminding us that humanity has navigated change far longer than any single system has existed. This awareness does not instruct behavior, it alters how experience is felt. Acknowledging prehistory is not about returning to earlier ways of life. It is about recognizing continuity beneath change. When the past extends further than memory, fear loses urgency. The future feels less like a cliff and more like a curve. Perspective replaces reaction. Modern life encourages immediacy. Information arrives constantly, demanding response. Problems appear unprecedented. Remembering deep time counters this illusion. It reminds us that adaptation preceded explanation, that resilience formed before documentation. Humanity learned to adjust long before it learned to record. This memory does not belong to archives. It belongs to sensation, to rhythm, to repetition. Recognizing it reintroduces patience. Urgency fades when continuity becomes visible. The present becomes one moment among many, rather than the moment that defines everything. Humility grows from this shift. When time expands, certainty shrinks. Answers feel provisional. Beliefs soften. Identity gains flexibility. This is not loss of meaning. It is release from rigidity. The twist is philosophical. Remembering prehistory changes the present more than the past. It alters tone rather than content. The same events feel different when framed against deep time. Crisis becomes context. Change becomes expected. Stability becomes temporary rather than assumed. This perspective does not demand agreement. It invites space. It allows decisions to breathe. When the past is long, patience becomes rational. Adaptability becomes natural. Reaction slows without disappearing. Deep time also restores proportion. Individual lives feel significant without needing to feel central. Cultures matter without needing permanence. Meaning survives change rather than depending on it. There is quiet relief in this awareness. The world feels less brittle. Systems feel less absolute. Certainty feels less required. Remembering prehistory becomes an emotional recalibration, not an intellectual claim. As this understanding settles, explanation loses urgency. Questions soften. Curiosity replaces conclusion. The need to resolve history gives way to willingness to sit with it. This is where the journey begins to release its grip. Perspective has widened enough. The story no longer needs to press forward. What remains is stillness, carrying everything that came before without asking to be named. It does not seek resolution. Stillness allows meaning to rest without form. The past settles into background, no longer demanding interpretation. What was once questioned becomes felt. Silence regains presence. In this state, attention widens gently. The need to extract lessons fades. History becomes atmosphere rather than argument. Time stretches outward, dissolving urgency. Nothing needs to be concluded. The effect is subtle. Perspective changes posture. The mind relaxes its grip on certainty. Questions remain, but they no longer press. Awareness replaces explanation. Presence replaces proof. This calm widening prepares the ground for closure without ending. Understanding no longer seeks dominance. It becomes receptive. The story does not demand continuation. It invites rest. From here, the journey moves toward release. What has been explored does not need resolution. Its value lies in recognition. The past becomes spacious, the present gentle, the future open. Remembering prehistory leaves no instruction. It offers orientation. Time feels larger. Life feels less confined. Meaning breathes. As this awareness deepens, movement slows. The narrative loosens. Explanation steps aside. What remains is continuity without demand. This is not an ending. It is a return to stillness. A place where the need to know gives way to the willingness to feel. The listener is left without conclusion, but not without grounding. The long view settles quietly, creating space for reflection rather than certainty. Time opens instead of closes. In that openness, the final movement approaches, not as answer but as release. The weight of explanation lifts. With perspective widened, the story no longer needs to instruct. It can dissolve. Silence becomes presence. Continuity becomes enough. The remainder is quiet, Time stretches outward. Attention settles. What follows requires no words, only stillness, carrying everything forward without effort. This is where the past releases its grip, and the present exhales, opening the space where the journey ends without ending. Nothing further needs to be carried forward. The story does not end where attention stops. It continues without pause, without witness, without needing to be named. Time moves forward not as a sequence of events, but as motion that never learned how to rest. Long after stories fade, patterns persist. Long after voices fall silent, movement carries on. Civilizations rise slowly, almost imperceptibly, and dissolve the same way. Their edges soften, their structures erode. What once required explanation settles back into landscape. Walls collapse into lines of stone. Roads fade into paths, then into soil, then into nothing that can be pointed to. Names lose their urgency. Functions disappear. What remains is continuity without memory. This does not happen because attention leaves. It happens because movement does not depend on attention to exist. Rivers continue carving paths regardless of who watches. Forests reclaim ground without asking permission. Wind crosses the same distances long after borders disappear. Time does not wait for meaning to catch up. It does not require acknowledgement to proceed. From a human view, this can feel unsettling. We are accustomed to measuring significance through preservation. Endings imply loss. Silence suggests erasure. But from a wider perspective, nothing ends. It transforms. What dissolves does not vanish. It redistributes. Influence continues through form rather than record. Civilizations do not fail when they fade. They complete a cycle. Their materials return to use elsewhere. Their patterns echo forward in altered shape. Skills thin into instinct. Beliefs soften into habit. Knowledge disperses into countless actions no longer traced to origin. Seen this way, history becomes a passing surface on a deeper current. Attention gathers briefly, then moves on. Meaning concentrates, then spreads out again. Nothing pauses long enough to be claimed as permanent. Time resists enclosure. It carries everything forward by letting go. This realization invites rest. The pressure to understand diminishes. The need to preserve loosens. If continuity does not rely on memory, then forgetting is not failure. It is release. What no longer needs to be held is allowed to move on. The breath of this moment is slow. The story does not rush toward conclusion. It widens. Urgency dissolves. Explanation steps aside. What remains is motion without direction, continuity without demand. Generations appear, live, and pass, without knowing how they will be interpreted. Most lives unfold entirely outside of history. They shape conditions they will never see, and influence futures they will never name. This is not tragic. It is ordinary. Life moves forward by participation, not remembrance. What once felt important loses outline at a distance. What felt fleeting reveals endurance. Stone erodes. Patterns persist. Forms dissolve. Motion remains. The world does not ask to be understood. It continues. This is the quiet comfort beneath impermanence. Nothing needs to stay still to matter. Nothing must be remembered to continue shaping what comes next. History is not a container. It is a passage. As attention relaxes, the story becomes less about us and more about movement itself. The need to place oneself inside the narrative fades. Presence gives way to participation. Life is lived, not archived. In this widening, even the idea of ending dissolves. There is no final chapter, only ongoing change. The story does not conclude. It shifts. It thins. It spreads into everything that follows. This is where the documentary begins to release its hold. The listener is no longer guided forward by curiosity. There is nothing left to seek. The story continues whether or not it is followed. Silence grows here, not as absence, but as space. Space where movement does not need commentary. Space where continuity unfolds on its own terms. The sense of story loosens. What remains is rhythm. Rise, settle, fade, return. Not as cycle to be explained, but as motion to be felt. Nothing is lost because it ends. Ending is only a change in shape. Attention comes and goes. Time does not notice. The story continues without us, carried forward by everything that never needed a witness in the first place. And in this understanding, the need to hold on dissolves. The present softens. The listener is free to rest inside motion rather than observe it. As urgency releases, the narrative prepares to give way entirely, turning towards silence, not as void, but as presence itself, where continuity no longer requires words. Not everything that mattered was meant to last. This idea rests quietly beneath the surface of history, often overlooked because it offers no evidence to point toward. Silence is usually interpreted as loss, as something taken away or forgotten. But silence can also mean completion. It can mean that nothing more was required. Much of human experience unfolded without leaving marks behind because marks were unnecessary. Knowledge lived long enough to serve its purpose, then dissolved back into use. Meaning was carried through action, not preservation. When conditions changed, what no longer applied was released without grief. There was no obligation to remember beyond usefulness. Written memory created the expectation that value must endure. If something mattered, it should remain visible. But this expectation belongs to permanence, not to life itself. Many things matter only within the moment that holds them. Their value lies in response, not in survival. Silence follows naturally when a thing completes its role. What was never written was not erased. It simply moved on. Experiences were absorbed into habit. Skills thinned into instinct. Understanding became orientation rather than statement. Nothing was lost. It was redistributed. This perspective changes how absence feels. Instead of emptiness, silence becomes space. Space for continuity to unfold without being named. Space where influence remains active without trace. The past does not vanish here. It relaxes into background, still shaping movement, still informing rhythm. There is peace in this idea. The pressure to recover, to reconstruct, to catalogue fades. Not everything needs to be saved to matter. Not everything meaningful demands proof. Silence holds what does not need explanation. From this angle, forgetting is not failure, it is completion. What no longer needs attention releases its hold. Continuity does not depend on memory, it depends on motion. What persists does so because it fits, not because it is remembered. This understanding resolves the tension that runs through the story. Absence is not a gap to be filled, it is another form of presence. Influence does not require record, meaning does not require endurance. Silence is not the opposite of knowing, it is knowing without display. For those listening quietly, this realization settles gently. There is no urgency here, no revelation to defend, only a widening sense that time carries more than it shows. That what shaped humanity deeply does not need to announce itself. The calm of this moment comes from release. The need to trace every thread loosens. What matters has already moved forward. Nothing asks to be retrieved. Nothing is missing in the way loss implies. Silence becomes something that can be rested in. A pause without lack. A fullness without description. Where meaning no longer needs to be proven to exist. As this acceptance deepens, the narrative itself begins to fade. Not because it has failed, but because it has done enough. Explanation gives way to presence. The story loosens its grip entirely. From here, there is no need to search for conclusions. What has been explored has already settled. The absence once questioned now feels supportive, holding everything without insisting on form. With silence understood as continuity, the final movement approaches naturally. Not as ending, but as stillness. Not as resolution, but as rest. The listener is no longer guided. There is nothing left to follow. Only space remains, wide enough to hold everything that came before. In this space, the distinction between story and silence dissolves. What was spoken blends back into what never needed words. Continuity carries on quietly, unchanged by attention. This is where the journey softens completely. Nothing closes, nothing concludes. Silence holds without asking. And from that holding, the last step is simple: letting go. The narrative now withdraws without disappearance, allowing what remains to breathe, preparing gently for the final release, where even silence itself steps aside. Some questions are not meant to be answered, only held. This understanding arrives quietly, without announcement, as the need to resolve begins to loosen. The mind, so accustomed to seeking clarity, discovers another way of knowing. Not through conclusion, but through orientation. Not through explanation, but through how time itself begins to feel. Throughout this journey, questions have surfaced and shifted. They invited attention, widened perspective, unsettled certainty. Now they soften. They no longer ask to be solved. They settle into presence, changing posture rather than demanding response. The absence of answers does not feel empty, it feels spacious. Understanding does not always arrive as information. Sometimes it arrives as calm, as a gentler relationship with uncertainty, as permission to stop reaching forward. What once felt unresolved now feels complete, simply because it no longer presses. History does not require closure to be meaningful. It does not need to be finished to inform. What matters is not that every gap be filled, but that awareness remains open. Completion is a desire shaped by structure. Meaning exists without it. As the story releases its grip, time begins to widen again. The past stretches outward without edges. The present softens. The future no longer insists on direction. Everything rests inside continuity rather than sequence. This is not resignation. It is rest. The kind that comes after tension releases, when effort gives way to acceptance. Questions remain, but they are no longer urgent. They are companions rather than tasks. The need to categorize fades. Labels lose importance. The distinction between what is known and unknown grows quieter. Awareness expands without needing form. Silence becomes familiar, no longer something to fill. What has been explored does not need to be gathered into summary. It does not need to be carried forward as lesson. Its effect is already present, shaping perception gently, without insistence. Time no longer feels like a problem to solve. It feels like a space to inhabit. History becomes background rather than burden. The weight of explanation dissolves. This final reveal is not dramatic. It is human. The realization that understanding does not require completion, that the past does not demand resolution, that presence can replace certainty. The story does not conclude because there is nothing to conclude. It simply steps aside. Words slow. Attention rests. What remains is stillness, not as emptiness, but as fullness without edges. In this stillness, questions lose shape. They do not vanish. They relax. They become part of atmosphere rather than focus. The need to define softens. This is where the journey ends without ending, where movement continues without commentary, where continuity no longer requires guidance. The beginning and the end touch here, not through explanation, but through quiet recognition. Silence holds everything that words could not, and does so effortlessly. Nothing further is required. The listener is not asked to decide, to remember, or to agree, only to rest inside awareness that has already shifted. Time stretches outward again. The sense of arrival dissolves. What remains is presence without demand. History does not need to be completed to be meaningful. Life does not need to be explained to continue. Questions do not need answers to matter. And so the story releases itself, returning to where it began. Not with certainty, but with stillness. The question rests.